Hello, and in today's video we're going to look at a classic role-playing game, the Fantasy Trip. Now the Fantasy Trip actually started life with metagaming, I think it was, way back in 1977 as the Fantasy Trip Melee. It then got expanded the following year by the Fantasy Trip Wizard, and these are the recent Steve Jackson Games reissues. Then in around 1980 it got sort of turned into a role-playing game via I think it was actually called Into the Labyrinth and Advanced Wizard and Advanced Melee. And that converted what was basically a hex and token war game into a role-playing game. So as you can see in Melee, you get this sort of rather abstracted hex battle mat with these rather quaint, fairly basic tokens, and that would allow you to maneuver around and do tactical battles. And then it got expanded with magic, which also introduced, I think, bigger monsters. But it was Into the Labyrinth that really turned it around and created a role-playing game. Now I believe Steve Jackson lost the rights to Into the Labyrinth and the company Metagaming went bust, so he sort of spun off the prototype rules, I guess, from the Fantasy Trip into something that you may have heard of called GURPS in about 1986. But in 2014, he had reacquired access to the rules and he republished it as the product you can see here. Now, I wish I could have got on the Kickstarter, because it was this thing called the Legacy Edition, which was a great big box with all sorts of rules and expansions and extra box and everything. And it's actually pretty hard to get hold of in the UK. This is actually a print-on-demand copy, which I think I got off Amazon if I remember correctly. So this is the second edition, second printing of August 2020, and the colours, they don't exactly leap off the page. They're a little bit muted, particularly in comparison to the rather nice box sets, which I had to get hold of via eBay in the end. And that is the big problem I find with a lot of Steve Jackson games is the Kickstarters are really good if you're based in America, but for us here over in Europe and in particular in the UK, they're not always ideal. Now, what is this product? Well, this in theory is all you need to play the game, although rather irritating, it does sometimes refer to, as you remember from Melee, well, if you don't own it, you're not going to remember it, so that's a little bit irritating. But that's just a minor nitpick. Now, the actual rules are laid out in a bit of a weird way for me. So on page 4, we get an intro to role-playing, and that, reads quite nicely. It then jumps straight into game mastering, talk about reaction rolls and success rolls and saving throws and injury and death. That just seems a bit weird that that's where you go straight to. We then got a little glossary and some definitions, which is always quite nice. And then we get character creation on page 12. So for me, I think the layout of this rulebook does slightly get in the way of learning the rules. But as with a lot of products, when you kind of read it cover to cover or jump in and read bits, actually a lot of these problems go away. Now, the character generation is interesting because it's fairly simple. You're either a fighter or a wizard. Now, fighters are really good at doing what's known as talents or skills, whereas wizards are obviously better at casting magic. But that doesn't mean fighters can't learn magic and wizards can't learn talents. It just costs you more money or XP to do so. So the basic rules are you have 3 statistics or attributes. So you've got strength, dexterity and IQ. They all start at 8 and you get 8 points to upgrade your various bits. So for example, you could upgrade strength from 8 to 16 and leave your dexterity and IQ at 8, or maybe make your IQ 16 and leave the other 2 at 8. So this means all starting characters have 32 points of attributes. So 8 plus 8 plus 8 plus your bonus 8 gets you to 32. So it talks about what you might need to do to kind of create your character, and it talks about the various scales here. So at 28, you've got a low, average or immature riffraff. At 32, you've got a starting character. At 36, above average. So that's your total points. And that becomes important for XP, which comes on a bit later. It then jumps into spells. Now, spells normally cost sort of 1 IQ point, so to speak, to buy. But they also have a limit. So they go from IQ 8 up to IQ 20. So if you've got an IQ of 9 or higher, you can learn IQ 8 and IQ 9 spells. And typically it's going to cost you effectively 1 IQ point to learn. So if you've got an IQ of 8, you can only learn the IQ 8 spells, and you can only learn 8 of them, because they're going to cost you 1 IQ point each. However, if you're a fighter, they actually cost you more. So for a fighter, they're going to need to spend 3 IQ points. So if you've got an IQ of 9 as a fighter and you want to learn spells, you're only going to be able to learn 3 of them. And it goes on for quite a while, because it goes all the way up to level 20. So we then get into what's known as talents, or skills, if you like. Now, skills have an equivalent sort of thing. So you have an IQ level requirement, so IQ 7, and I believe they top out at IQ 14. But in addition, they come with a cost, and that's normally either 1, 2, or 3. So, for example, to learn the brawling talent, you need to have an IQ of 7, and it's going to cost you 1 sort of IQ point to learn. Again, though, that's if you're a fighter this time, but for a wizard, it's going to be triple the cost, if I remember correctly. So Brawling for a wizard is going to cost them 3 of their IQ points. So as you can see, there's a sort of a point buy system in your character creation, and it's not too difficult, but it takes a little bit of getting used to. We then got a bit about XP. Now, when you level up your character, you can have money, a limited wish, mana to put into your staff if you're a wizard, which makes it easier to cast spells, because casting spells costs you mana, which is effectively strength points, which also double as hit points. You can buy a new talent, you can buy a new spell, or you can improve an attribute, and that's on a sliding scale, which is listed here. So the starting character can increase 2 attributes by 1 point, or 1 attribute by 2 points, at a cost of 100 XP per point. But once you start going beyond that, it gets more and more expensive. So by the time you get to 37 points, it's going to cost you 600 XP to increase by that 1 point. So if you've got, let's say, 9 in each of the 3, you're starting to get up there in the cost. If you've got 10 in the 3, well, again, it's pushing you higher up. Once you get to like 15 in the 3, well, you're at 45 points or higher, so it's going to cost you an absolute fortune to level up your attribute. It talks about retiring. It then jumps into designing a labyrinth. Now, a labyrinth is effectively your dungeon crawl, but it does have rules for overland, which comes on, and there's page after page of stuff about sort of creating the world and thieves' guilds and preparing for an adventure and finding employees and traps and all sorts of stuff. Then we finally get to a sort of bestiary, which is on page 77, and there's some interesting critters in here, including sort of intelligent walking octopuses, which I do quite like, and I've got a very nice 3D printed model that would be good for that. We then get into what they call advanced combat and advanced magic. So here we go, page 101 is advanced combat, and advanced magic is, keep going, so it's quite a lot about advanced combat. Here you go, advanced magic starts at 134. Now in advanced combat it does talk about weapons and their damage and armour and optional rules for ablative armour, so if you keep wailing on someone, eventually the armour's going to wear down. Now, one of the criticisms I have of this is that sometimes I almost wonder if armour's worth it, because leather armour, for example, is going to prevent 2 damage, but it's also going to cost you 2 dexterity, so you're less nimble. And I think some of these dexterity penalties are a bit steep, so a really high quality, fine piece of plate armour is going to stop 6 hits, which is great, but it's going to cost you 4 dexterity, and it's going to cost you $5,000. For some reason, all the money in this game is just in very boring dollars, not silver pieces or gold pieces or anything like that. We then actually get to items after all the magic stuff. 148, I believe, is the page number. Yeah, so we get into magic items, creating them and all sorts of business like that. and then greater magic items, cost of ingredients for potions. We then get into some adventures right at the back. So, yeah, I mean, it's an interesting set of rules. It's at its heart, it's pretty basic, but they then add some little wiggly pieces, and I think that's partly because it started off as this sort of very simple pocketbook sort of battle game. Now, how does the actual game work? Well, you have a test where you'll roll an amount of dice. Now, typically that's going to be 3 dice, and they're all going to be d6s. And you're needing to roll under an attribute, typically. So, for example, in combat, you're going to roll under your dexterity to hit someone. So, obviously, the higher your dexterity, the more likely you are to hit. And basically, an average d6 roll on 3d6 is, I think it's officially 10.5. So, you're going to want your dex to be 10, ideally, to guarantee that most of the time you're going to hit. But obviously, occasionally you're going to roll high and occasionally you're going to roll low. And so that's a bit of an interesting proposition. The other thing that you need to watch out for with this game is there's lots of attribute modifiers. So you always roll under, let's say, your dex to hit, but maybe you've got a height advantage, so you get a +2 to your dex. Or maybe you're outnumbered, so you get a -1 to your dex, whatever it happens to be. So, as I say, at its heart, it's a basic set of rules, but the advanced combat adds a lot of tactical crunch, and as you can see, there's all sorts of talk about positioning and throwing weapons and mounted combat and bits and pieces like that. It does also have, as I say, some really horrendous weapon damage. So, for example, if you can wield it, a great sword, it's going to require you have a strength of 16 to actually wield it, but it's going to do 3d6 plus 1 damage. That's 4 to 19 damage. Well, that's pretty devastating if someone's got no armour, because, bear in mind, most people are going to struggle to get their strength up there, because you've only got 8 starting points, so if someone puts all their points into strength, they're going to have 16 strength. Well, one hit from a great sword at maximum damage just outright kills that person. Now, if they've got plate armour that's going to block, let's say, 6 points of damage, if you roll 19 damage, that means anyone with 12 or less strength is just outright dead. So I think that's pretty savage. So I do wonder if they would have been better off going the original D&D route of all weapons do 1d6 damage, and then maybe just have like +1 or +2 or +3 for the weapons, and then have the armour, block like 1, 2 or 3 damage. Now, the one good thing about the armour is, in theory, you could wear plate mail and have a shield, and that combines to block quite a lot of damage. So if we look at the armour, for example, fine plate will block 6 points, and with a large shield you can block a further 2, so you could block 8 damage per hit. But even so, as again, if we take that great sword at maximum damage, and admittedly it is maximum damage, that's 13 damage once you take into account the fine plate, but hold on, that's 9, so that's going to be 10 damage. So if you roll 19 damage in total, -9 for the armour, that's 10 damage. So you're going to need a strength of 11 just to withstand one strike from a great weapon rolling maximum damage. Now, admittedly on 3d6 the average is 10, so 6 plus 3 is 9, so you're only going to take 1 point of damage on average. So yeah, it's tricksy to know what to do there. But that's the only real criticisms I have of the product, is I think that the damage and the armour's a bit wonky for me, but it's not a disaster, and the layout gets in the way of understanding the rules. Now, the only other criticism is your IQ seems very important, because you need an IQ to learn skills and spells, and also to be able to learn those in the first place, because you've got that sort of threshold. So like brawling's fairly simple, you only need an IQ of 7, but let's have a look. Let's see one of the higher ones. So let's say you want to be a weapon master. Well, you're going to need an IQ of 13 to pick that skill, and then it gives you a load of little benefits there. So that means pumping points into your IQ seems pretty important. Now, you could choose to just pump a load of points into your strength to make sure you can actually survive, and then once you've picked up enough XP, you can then level up your IQ. But it does mean IQ is really important to be able to be, let's say, competent. But again, maybe that's a deliberate choice. You know, if you choose to be competent, you're going to be physically weak and have a low strength and a low dex, which means you're going to find it harder to dodge or hit or absorb a hit from someone. So there is that sort of balance there. But yeah, it's a little bit odd. Now, the other thing is spells actually cost you mana, which is effectively your strength. So as you're casting spells, you're effectively damaging yourself. So that can be a bit savage. Now, I'm surprised they didn't say, oh, your strength creates hit points and mana as a separate thing. But, you know, again, that's probably because of the origins of it being this sort of hex-based game where you've got to balance casting your spells versus the amount of damage it's going to do to the opponent. So there you go. That is a quick look at the Fantasy Trip. As I say, it's a fairly well-loved system. It's pretty simple to pick up and play. And obviously, you know, you don't need to learn absolutely everything in this book to get going with it. And it is being very well supported by Steve Jackson Games. So overall, I think it gets a thumbs up. And I do obviously quite enjoy it, and I would like to get some more play of it. And I think it's definitely one for you to take a look at. Anyway, I think that's enough. So I hope you've enjoyed this quick look at the Fantasy Trip by Steve Jackson Games. And I'm going to look into maybe delving deeper into the system and have a closer look at Melee and Wizard. But that's something for the future. I wouldn't hold your breath on that. So anyway, while you're waiting for that, until the next one, happy gaming.